Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island and we are discussing thematic elements. Today we're discussing plot. Essentially, plot is simply what happens in a story. Character A does this, character B does this, etc., etc. When you ask somebody what a movie's about and they start saying, well, it's about this guy who does this thing and blah, 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 they're actually giving you plot. Plot is important as an identifier as to the author's construction of a story. And certainly I do not want you to simply tell me plot for the sake of filling up a paper. However, when we're evaluating plot, there are very specific things I need you to evaluate. And these things are particular elements I'm looking for on especially your first English 101 paper. Essentially, the plot elements are as follows. The first thing you want to establish is whether or not the plot is linear or nonlinear. A linear plot is one in which the events go in a sequential order. In other words, it starts at one point in time and the story moves forward consecutively through time without jumping around. The way a plot becomes nonlinear is usually because a character, we're with a character as we begin, and then the author stops and moves to another character in another place and may eventually bring them together. Or a story becomes nonlinear if the story jumps backward in time. Obvious famous versions of the nonlinear plot would be things like Pulp Fiction and Memento, where they're playing with a fairly simple storyline, and they present it in nonlinear fashion in order to, frankly, make it more interesting and to create a sense of mystery. Identify the plot as linear by simply explaining that the story is sequential. Certainly for a story like What You Pawn I Will Redeem, since the story is identified by time stamps as they go through the day, it's a pretty clear idea that the story is placed in a linear fashion. If you're going to show me that it's nonlinear, just give me an example of when it jumps out of time. More complex works generally are nonlinear, and certainly a multi-character storyline is going to be nonlinear. The next thing to consider about plot is elements of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing occurs when the author essentially tells you something in an indirect way that indicates that something later on is going to happen. Standard elements of foreshadowing in movies would be the use of sound, such as the use of violins to show tension when you realize that the person opening the door is about to be hit in the head with an axe. But foreshadowing also occurs in standard ways in which something happens early on that actually predicts future behavior. In fact, foreshadowing does lead to a certain element of predictability in terms of the storyline. We'll get to predictability in a second. For example, in What You Pawn I Will Redeem, the character Jackson Jackson gets some money from the pawnbroker and immediately runs out with his friends. They pull their money together and they buy 3 bottles of wine and drink them down. This actually foreshadows essentially what happens every time Jackson Jackson gets money. Every time he gets money, he spends it, mostly on alcohol. This early incident foreshadows what is about to happen, and also in some ways foreshadows that is unlikely that at the end of the story Jackson Jackson is going to have $1,000. Foreshadowing also works in more subtle ways. In Tooth and Claw, for example, the author's portrayal of the main character as being stuck in his old ways, despite his intention to not be stuck in his father's ways specifically, indicates that in some ways that he may end up there at the end of the story, and certainly that is indeed what happens. Foreshadowing is, for writing purposes, is fairly simple. Identify something that happens early on and explain what it creates in terms of predictability for later on in the story, which leads us to predictability. Predictability in a story is not knowing the specific details. If you go to see a romantic comedy or you read a romance novel, for example, you expect that the main characters, the male and female, as it usually is, will somehow find each other, be torn apart by something, and then find each other again at the end of the story. What makes the story rewarding is the fact that it pays off in the end with essentially a happy ending. What we don't know is how that's going to happen. What we don't know are the struggles in between. And in fact, the reason we go to a movie like that is with every expectation that's going to end up with a happy ending. If it does not have a happy ending, people are going to be very unhappy, and that movie is going to do very poorly, that book is going to do very poorly. What we're there for is to show the arc of the story, the arc of the plot. And the predictability has to do with, we know that there's going to be some kind of struggle. It would be predictable if there is a third person involved who distracts one or other of the characters. It is very predictable that if this is a romantic comedy, that there's going to be some humorous, farcical kind of stuff going on there. And ultimately at the end, we expect everybody to be happy and be all smiles because that's what we want. Same with your standard slasher horror flick. Predictability, we know people are going to be killed. We'd be disappointed if there weren't. We expect some violence and some gore. Specifics of what's going to be what, that's the surprise element, and that's why we're there. We want to be surprised. We want to be shocked. And in fact, some foreshadowing occurs because what the author will do, especially for horror movies, is that they'll tease you a few times with things that look like it's going to be something horrific, and then it turns out to be something else, and the audience laughs and is relieved. And then when the axe really comes down in a similar situation later, we are both shocked and surprised and just a little bit more horrified because after a while we keep thinking that we're just going to be seeing another humorous joke. These levels of manipulation of the audience are very consistent with authors, and they do this on purpose because that's why we go. We want to be played with in that particular way. And the predictability aspect simply has to do with when something early on happens in the story, it predicts a future reference, which means that you can use foreshadowing and predictability together to explain how the author sets something up and later pays it off. Speaking of horror movies, another element is called suspense. Suspense uses a certain type of foreshadowing to create an expectation on the part of the reader that something's going to happen, whether it happens or not. There's a certain level of suspense as to whether or not Jackson will get the regalia back. There's a certain level of suspense as to whether or not Jackson is going to win when he scratches lottery tickets. For most literary works, suspense is usually creation of us wanting something to happen or not wanting something to happen that the author has foreshadowed may very well happen. And whether they make it pay off or not depends where the story's going. But for example, if you know that in your romantic comedy or your romantic novel that a girl has to make a decision between two men and you like one more than the other, there's suspense as to which one she's going to choose, and hopefully she chooses the right one and then you're happy and fulfilled, and if she chooses the wrong one, then you're kind of disappointed. And that's essentially the nature of suspense. It does not have to be high tension. It doesn't have to be something as tense as some kind of thriller drama or anything like that, although those obviously use suspense. But suspense can also be very subtle. The elements of plot, suspense, foreshadowing, predictability, linear versus nonlinear, all of these elements make up how an author creates a story that engages the reader. And therefore, when the characters walk through that, we begin to see how the author is really taking us on a little journey there and really manipulating things in a way to make the story enjoyable and still get his or her point across. The ending also must be discussed when you discuss plot. And with endings, while the ending is part of the plot, it's a specific part of the plot because it has its own elements. One of them is whether or not the primary conflict is resolved by the end of the story. If the conflict is resolved by the end of the story is considered, the ending is considered determinate. In other words, Jackson wants the regalia. At the end of the story, he gets the regalia. Determinate ending. Conversely, if the primary conflict is not resolved, there is no determinate ending. Therefore, it becomes an indeterminate ending. The main character in Tooth and Claw wants to change himself, wants to not be his father. At the end of the story, his conflict is not resolved. He is still just like his father, still calls himself Junior, still drives his dad's car, still hangs out in an old man's bar, still has not moved on in terms of creating relationships or anything like that. That ending is indeterminate. Also, since the fact that they don't really, he walks into a room and closes the door, we don't know what happens after that. That also adds a certain level of indeterminate nature. The other thing to consider with ending is whether the ending is happy or unhappy, and this has to do with plot manipulation. A happy ending is designed to create a work that is essentially commercial, that people are going to like. Unhappy endings are far more interpretive and force the reader to examine what happened in the story and therefore how it might apply to them. Identify whether the ending is happy or unhappy. And whether or not there's a kind of surprise. Perhaps some people thought that the pawnbroker giving the regalia to Jackson was a surprise. Perhaps they thought that Junior being dumped by Daria in Tooth and Claw was a surprise. Those elements would be something that you examine and ask the author why the author did that. Where the author often uses a surprise ending in a more manipulated way is in romantic comedies or in soap operas where some unknown factor that was not discussed or mentioned before in any obvious way comes up to fix whatever problem there may be. This is essentially kind of the cliffhanger thing, where in serial movies and serial teleplays, including soap operas and things like that, it seemed at the end of the chapter that there was going to be a demise for the main character, and then at the beginning of the next version of the chapter, they are somehow miraculously saved. In the old Batman television series, which I'm sure all of you are fully aware of, they would always end the first of two connected episodes with Batman and Robin in some horrible situation, about to be cut in half by some blade, or being eaten by sharks, or being drowned or something. And at the beginning of the next episode, Batman would pull something out of his utility belt, his anti-shark spray, his anti-giant saw spray, whatever it happens to be, and they would be redeemed and they would be saved. These surprises, kind of, in some ways, we like some of them. It depends on the type of material. And certainly that surprise ending makes the audience feel better, because it's, hey, the good guy won. But at the same time, there's a certain level of sophistication in which you're watching this and you recognize yourself, this is not realistic. This is not happening in a normal situation. The reason we examine this is because we want to know whether or not the work is more commercial or more interpretive. Commercial material tends to please the audience, even if they have to contrive the ending, even if they have to manipulate the plot, even if they have to create very identifiable stereotypical characters. The endings of more interpretive material tends to be less manipulated, more realistic, and in some ways less satisfying for the audience. But that's the nature of interpretive literature, which we will discuss at a different time. For plot, make sure your plot paragraph includes the plot elements and the ending elements, all in one. Get right to it and make sure that you label each one very clearly and find at least one example from the story. Okay? Stay in touch.